I know what you're probably about to say, but before you say anything, allow me a few sentences to explain myself. This is not a hit piece on The Last of Us. This is not a video where I'm going to say that the game is overrated, or that Naughty Dog has lost its edge, or anything like that. The Last of Us is an excellent experience, and it's an experience that I would say just about everybody should, well, experience. It's a once-in-a-generation kind of game, one of the most influential games in the modern era, to the point that just about every major PlayStation exclusive game that's come out since has been built in some way off of the back of Naughty Dog's magnum opus. That's the entire PlayStation 4 library, except for maybe Knack, an entire generation of greatness that has awaited us in some small part thanks to this game here. Now, with all that said, The Last of Us is not perfect, and it never was. On the contrary, it's a flawed game on a few fronts. There were some rather significant cracks in this foundation even back when it first released in 2013, and the 6 years of innovation since have only magnified these issues even more. Games like God of War, Horizon Zero Dawn, even Naughty Dog's own PS4 Uncharted games all played with a deck that The Last of Us dealt, and each has taken those cards and made their own hands from it, improving narratively, mechanically, even ludonarratively. And it probably goes without saying, but these issues with The Last of Us clearly didn't hold the game back too much. But now that we've all had some significant time away from the game, I'd like to dive into these issues. It does us no good to put games blindly onto a pedestal, as it gives the team and the industry very little to work off of and improve upon, only hurting us all in the long run. To put it into other words, I'd like to discuss the flaws of The Last of Us because based on the footage that we've seen of Part 2 so far, I fear that the team at Naughty Dog is building on the first game's foundation without filling in many of those time-weathered cracks. And let me make it clear that some of these issues have already been addressed, which makes me incredibly happy. I want nothing more than for The Last of Us Part 2 to excel past the astronomical standards that Naughty Dog has set over the years. After all, we're talking about arguably the premier developer in the industry right now. There's no question that they're capable of handling these almost 7-year-old issues, especially since most, if not all of these issues were fixable even back when the game first released. Now, in the spirit of fairness, and to hopefully stave off as many of those preemptive angry comments as possible, I want to make it very, very clear that I'm not touching either game's presentation. The Last of Us pushed the PlayStation 3 to its absolute limit, and Part 2 is certainly going to do the same for the PS4. If you thought your system ran louder than a jet engine during God of War or Spider-Man, Part 2 might just make your PS4 break the sound barrier. Moreover, while The Last of Us has its fair share of weird bugs that pop up from time to time, that's a consequence of designing a complex game, and I'm not gonna knock it for one-off glitches. Lastly, I want to make it very clear right now that this video may contain visual spoilers for the first game throughout, and I'll warn you again later on before we touch on plot spoilers. With The Last of Us Remastered available for free to all PS Plus subscribers in October, you've got a chance right now to avoid those spoilers and play the game for yourself if you haven't already. Otherwise, you've been warned. One of the last things that usually gets talked about nowadays when it comes to The Last of Us is, funnily enough, its gameplay. Usually you'll hear first about the story, the acting, the themes, all of that good stuff, and then tacked on near the end you'll also hear, oh yeah, and it's pretty fun too. Believe it or not, until my most recent playthrough, my stance was the opposite. The tense third-person stealth shooter gameplay is what gripped me the most here. Whether it be sneaking through rooms and picking apart entire gangs of human bandits, hastily crafting together a medkit in my inventory while ducking behind shaky cover, throwing bottles to distract and just barely edge past a horde of infected fungus zombies, or let's be real, throwing Molotovs and letting the stupid infected run to their fiery demise, every action in The Last of Us has weight to it. However, when looking at it with fresh eyes, I couldn't help but notice that as a stealth game, or at the very least as a game that clearly incentivizes stealth, it's pretty lacking in acceptable stealth mechanics. On all but the 2 hardest difficulties, players have access to Heightened Hearing, a perk that Joel's developed over his 2 decades surviving in the apocalypse. It's effectively the bat sense mechanic that many 7th generation games loved to use, but it fits super well here, allowing you to sense movement through walls and plan your attacks and movements accordingly. You're not the only one with hearing though, as you can make some noise to draw enemies to you or to a specific choke point as necessary. Outside of these 2 things though, your stealth arsenal only consists of hope, inconsistent enemy AI, and later on a bow for quiet shots. When you sneak up behind an enemy and take him down, his body will stay right where it drops since you've got no ability to grab or carry corpses. Well, technically you can drag your foes a few feet while you're holding onto them from behind, but that's not going to be much help when another guard sees the body and alerts the others. The enemy vision cones and movement patterns are also, to say the least, relatively inconsistent. I've had encounters go sour thanks to being spotted or heard by an enemy that on the immediately subsequent attempt missed me from that same spot. Since enemies in The Last of Us are pretty cleanly split into a standard and a combat/search mode, with very little room for an alerted status in between, this small level of human inconsistency, while maybe more realistic or grounding, takes away a bit from the game part of this game. You have to be more or less perfect if you want to continue picking enemies apart from the shadows, and one single slip-up, even if it's one you can't control, will set that ticking bomb right off. Most other stealth modes, including many of The Last of Us's contemporaries, make use of a clear visual indicator when you're in enemy sights, even if you only have a split second before enemies shift from alerted into full-on attack mode. Some of you might say that including such an indicator would break immersion and hurt the overall game, but The Last of Us Part 2 has exactly this indicator. Even Part 1 already had a slight glow on the edges of your screen showing if an enemy was near or approaching, it just sadly didn't go the whole way. Part 2 also introduces some other interesting stealth options, such as more aggressive AI paths, craftable silencers which somehow weren't a thing throughout any of the first game's story, and everybody's favorite waist-high grass as seen in every PS4 game ever. Clearly, Part 2 is working off of the baseline built for Uncharted 4 when it comes to stealth, which is a very good thing, but to help keep you on your toes even more, it's also introducing enemy dogs that can supposedly track your scent so that you can't hide around in one spot for too long. This inclusion will likely force your hand into encounters much more quickly and much more frequently than the first game's stealth mechanics did, so it may be a give and take. But already, I'm happy with how Part 2 seems to be addressing the stealth issues. Still no lugging bodies around and hiding them behind cover as far as we can tell though. Now, if Part 2 were working off of the same focus as Part 1, I wouldn't exactly be happy about those dogs pushing you into combat, because the gunplay in the first game, by design, is not very good. 20 years after the fall of society, ammo is obviously a commodity and should be conserved at all times because every bullet matters. That's part of what makes my next issue so questionable. Joel cannot aim really. At the very start of the proper game, we learn that Joel is a smuggler who's become hardened by the previous 20 years of fungal apocalypse. He's killed many times before without hesitation and fired off countless bullets in the process. Yet when he first aims a gun, we're greeted with wild amounts of gun swaying and a lengthy aim down sight reticle time. Mind you, this is intentional. It's a way to ensure that you do aim your shots carefully to highlight again that every shot counts. The Last of Us isn't meant to be Uncharted or any third-person run-and-gun shooter. For that matter, you can't even run-and-gun really. There's no hipfire here. Instead, pressing R2 without aiming down your sight is your way of reloading. I understand all of this, and I understand the intent here, but I don't agree with the ludonarrative dissonance that it creates, and I especially don't agree with there being an in-game skill upgrade to reduce your weapon sway. It's one of the rare things in this game for which I can't easily suspend my disbelief because it's something that I have to constantly battle with when I battle, and since the stealth often forces me into a battle, I have to battle with it in battle a lot. I don't want or even expect Joel to have Nathan Drake's sometimes inhuman aim, but I certainly don't expect him to have the arm strength of a stormtrooper after we're told of all the things he's done with a gun. Then again, look how bad he is at darts. Maybe this dude just needs glasses. Contrarily, Ellie is the exact opposite here. In Part 1, when you control Ellie, her weapon sway and aim down sight time is significantly lowered since she naturally doesn't have Joel's upgradable skills. This leads to a pretty funny disconnect where a teenage girl is a better shot than a cold-blooded killer. And speaking of killers, Ellie in Part 2 seems to be going full Rambo. In the gameplay clips we've seen thus far, Ellie's aim down sight time is much faster, and she seems better at aiming while moving as well, all despite Ellie's hands shaking, seemingly from some form of post-traumatic stress throughout all of the gameplay segments we've seen. These are both welcome changes that will immediately improve the gunplay, and given the more aggressive enemies and where Part 2's story seems to be going, it makes far more narrative sense than Joel's noodle arm firing from the first game. So far, Part 2 is 2 for 2 when it comes to addressing the first game's issues, but the jury is definitely still out on these next few, which all sort of play together. One of the biggest problems I have with the game regards its pacing, or more specifically, its repetition. The Last of Us uses repetition to beautiful effect many times throughout the game, such as Ellie commenting,
"Can't deny that view,"
as bookends to the core adventure. However, when it comes to the downtime in The Last of Us, its repetitive nature comes back to bite it, and unlike Ellie, this bite spreads too far and too quickly. Whether it be boosting your partner up onto a higher ledge, grabbing and slowly navigating with a ladder to set it up a few feet nearby, activating a generator with all the aplomb of a dad trying to get his beat-up lawnmower going, slowly pulling a gate open, or, of course, wheeling around crates probably 100 times to quote-unquote solve puzzles that exist to give the console more time to load the next area, the stakes are by design lower in The Last of Us, especially when compared to Naughty Dog's Uncharted series. And of course, we want those stakes to be lower. Again, we're not Indiana Jones, and we're not in Shambhala anymore. But the sheer frequency with which these segments appear, and with one or two exceptions, the total lack of payoff that these situations provide, just slow The Last of Us down far past methodical into more tedious territory. Outside of the infamous generator section in the hotel basement, that generator pull minigame never really has a payoff. Outside of one section near the end of the Left Behind DLC, at that point probably close to 18 hours into your Last of Us experiences, moving crates around won't be a tense moment where you've got enemies on your tail. And outside of one or two fringe cases, you're never boosting an ally up or lugging a ladder around in a tense moment. The Last of Us almost seems afraid to combine the slower-paced story sections with the often terror-inducing gameplay sections, usually providing clear barriers as if to warn the player. For a game hailed as the culmination of the 7th generation of console gaming, it fell into the same sort of pitfalls as other third-person cover shooters of the time. When you walk into an area full of chest-high walls, you kinda know what's coming next. It's twice as frustrating near the end of the game when you just want to see the story progress and you're stuck in a repetitive tunnel section with more and more infected because it's easier to toss more enemies at you than it is to design another unique scenario for combat. And while, again, all of this repetition talk may sound like it's just a nitpick, it's something that Naughty Dog itself directly spoofed in Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, where players wheel around a crate once at the very start of the game only to immediately be told,
"How about we avoid crates from now on?" "Okay, good deal."
And for just about the entire game, you don't see a single damn crate. After both The Last of Us and Uncharted 4 used crates ad nauseum, I think the team got the hint to back off a bit. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I want to bring a counterexample to the table of an admittedly different game that makes sure that just about every seemingly frivolous mechanic has a somatic payoff. In 2014's Alien Isolation, in my opinion the greatest horror game ever made, you'll have to open doors with a big wrench jack, burn holes through emergency panels to activate the door override, and yes, even activate a generator with a time-consuming, tedious minigame. Even the very act of saving takes a few seconds to go through. Each one of these mechanics is subverted during at least one point of this game, or rather, by at least one thing in this game. In Isolation, the alien is more or less omnipresent, fueled by one of the most intelligent enemy AIs that gaming has seen thus far. It will hear you, it will learn from your tendencies, and it will pop out right when you least expect it to. And the thing is, you can't run because it's faster than you, and you can't fight because it's a practically invincible killing machine. Because you never know just when the creature will decide to come down from the vents, or when it'll enter the room, or what it'll hear, see, or smell, every moment that you spend cranking a door open, or cutting through metal, or even hoping, praying that you can save the game before you hear that horrifying screech and look down to find out that you've been impaled, is a moment that adds meaning and tension to the game's core philosophy. I know it came out a year and change before Isolation, but The Last of Us stumbles in this regard. We can clearly see that narrative repetition is meaningful and intentionally included for payoff, but mechanical repetition is a means to an end, a way to move our protagonists from spot to spot with sprinkled dialogue in between. Even something as simple as occasionally having to shake your controller to recharge your flashlight battery is never subverted. Imagine having your flashlight go out and stay out in an area where you really don't want to be left in the dark, and the game pops up the shake controller icon, and you're shaking the controller like it's WarioWare to no effect. Well, you actually don't have to imagine it because they did it in Uncharted 4, in one of the rare sequences where they use the flashlight in that game. In my opinion, this is a sign of an unsure development team experimenting on shakier ground, and it's something that should be respected, but also critiqued. The game rarely attempts action sequences in order to further solidify that this is a grounded experience, to draw a line in the sand between it and their other baby. But along the way, they still felt that higher octane sequences were sometimes necessary to break up the pace, and when we get these action sequences, they're at best hit or miss. Some sequences, like the short fight with a bandit that's trying to drown Joel, or the blizzard sequence from Winter, are absolute hits. The former is also just about the only time that ladder climbing is subverted, so double points on that one. Other sequences, like the extended, hey, here's an unkillable truck that's gonna chase and follow you for at least half an hour bit, or the upside down trap in Billstown, feel like they betray the focus of The Last of Us a little bit. These are attempts at something unique and memorable, but they feel more like scrapped Uncharted spots than something that was built from the ground up for this game. I mean, I swear to God, there's a weaponized Jeep section in every Naughty Dog game after Jack. What is it with these guys and ridiculously strong Jeeps? The upside down section especially feels out of place, with its unlimited ammo and with Joel's suddenly stable aiming despite being, again, upside down. It's also, funnily enough, the first of 2 times in 2013 where a high-profile game had an upside-down shooting sequence, as GTA 5 did the same bit just a few months later. Similarly, almost every chase sequence where you're running towards somebody or away from the infected doesn't have a real feeling of tension, with the exception of the aforementioned chase sequence in Left Behind. All the other ones are just kind of there, and just there doesn't really cut it in this game. I don't feel that these repetitive bits have a strong justification for returning in Part 2 unless the game starts breaking down the barrier between story-heavy and gameplay-heavy sequences. Judging by what we've heard from hands-on previews so far, it sounds like there might be an even greater divide between the 2 distinct segments, but we'll come back to that later. This brings me to the final 2 points from The Last of Us Part 1 that I fear may not properly be addressed in Part 2, and again, these two are somewhat related. This is also the point where you'll probably want to check out if you're afraid of spoilers. This is your final warning. First and foremost is the game's occasional failure at upholding the player's suspension of disbelief. Some of you seasoned Last of Us players probably noticed one repetitive mechanic that I didn't touch on: the pallet that Joel will use to carry Ellie across bodies of water. Ellie informs Joel very early on in the summer that she can't swim, and the game makes sure to remind you of that at least once per hour. And yet, over the course of the game, despite Joel teaching Ellie countless survival skills, at no point during their nearly year-long odyssey did Joel take a moment to teach her how to tread water. She nearly drowns twice during this span, remember, and right before they get to Tommy, Ellie directly acknowledges how often she's had to stand on a pallet.
I know, step on the fucking pallet.
Considering the two had to be near water dozens of times during their trek westward in order to, find drinkable water, I don't know, it's just hard to believe. Of everything she encounters in the game, her biggest adversary isn't clickers or tribes of hunters, it's not starving, it's not even major surgery, it's the fact that she sinks like a rock and it's just kind of left there. She's only been shown riding a boat so far when it comes to water in Part 2, so she still might not know how to swim several years after this game. That would have been the first thing that I'd teach her, and I'm not even a good swimmer. Another, much smaller example is that throughout the entire game, there are no female human enemies. This was almost certainly a systems limitation issue rather than a moral decision, given that women were actually taken out of the game before release, but it's still hard to overlook once you notice it. In fact, you probably didn't notice that I've only used male pronouns for the human enemies this entire time. Part 2 is already treading down a similar path with moments that just take me out of the moment. For example, apparently Ellie can recognize Joel based on the texture of his hand over her mouth from behind, that's certainly not believable. Also, that is really weird. I don't know that I like the implication that... Dad? Major surgery touches on the second major point where I just can't suspend my disbelief anymore, and you all know this one too. At the end of the fall chapter, Joel is knocked off a 10-foot balcony onto a long, rusty piece of metal rebar. It luckily falls in exactly the right place so as to not puncture any major organs, just straight up missing everything and going clean through Joel's stomach. Ellie then helps pull him up off the rebar, except she does so at an angle, which surely caused some more damage, and then Joel continues to win a few gunfights while bleeding profusely onto everything around him before falling off the horse and being dragged to a nearby shopping center by Ellie. As we see in Left Behind, she then takes about 20 minutes to find medical supplies while Joel is still sitting there bleeding out with only a rag and some tape putting pressure on the hole that's opened up at least a couple inches through his entire gut. The reason I mention this section isn't just to argue that it's not realistic, because if I wanted to do that, I would talk about how you can choke a guy out 5 steps away from his friend and somehow nobody will hear the struggle or choking sounds. Or, I would talk about how Ellie is invisible to enemies even if she runs right in front of them. No, the reason that I bring up the fact that Joel almost certainly should have died here is that The Last of Us focuses on the brutality of man and the effect that it has on people. This game is meant to make you feel uncomfortable, to make you question whether all the killing you're doing is truly right, and to make you question if your methods of killing are justified. Some of the kills in The Last of Us are abhorrent. Slicing a dude's neck open on a shard of window glass, bashing skulls into desk corners, Joel straight up tortures some people, and that's while dealing with the stitches and subsequent infection from his stomach hole. We see the bodies of those that shot themselves during the outbreak, those that committed suicide in the bathtub, those that hung themselves. We see cannibalism, we hear about pillaging, and, that other thing. It's not an easy game on the mind. Joel falling onto the rebar reflects that, and in that way it fits. Everybody repents at some point for the sins they commit during the end times, and this was their luck running out. Except for the fact that it didn't actually run out since he survived, but shut up. With all of this said, I never really felt bad for the people that Joel and Ellie took down in this game, because they're pretty much all irredeemable people until near the end of the game. The shades of gray that were advertised so heavily as the selling point of this game are only present with characters like Sam or Henry, or in the very rare line of enemy dialogue where they're talking about preserved bacon or something. Instead of laughing about gunning down or eating random people for no good reason. It was one of the main goals of The Last of Us to make you question the protagonist's kills, to think of the other side of the fight, and until the final section of the game, I can't say I did, because from Pittsburgh to Colorado, most everybody you fought was a bad person. That's just the name of the world now. It's brutal. This brutality is central to The Last of Us as a franchise, but from the bits that we've seen of Part 2, this is actually an issue that I have with it that I didn't have with Part 1. Story director Neil Druckmann has said that the goal of The Last of Us Part 2 is to make the player physically uncomfortable, even more so than the first game did. Having the player kill dogs and giving each person and each dog their own name is already an easy way to do that, so mission accomplished on the ground floor there. However, where The Last of Us was brutal, Part 2 might go a bit too far and lose itself in that, just as they're implying that Ellie will lose herself in her lust for revenge. Thematically, it works wonderfully. I just fear that they're going to overdo it. Ellie's already slicing necks and unapologetically bashing skulls. But we've seen in just a couple trailers people being eviscerated, lynchings, heads being caved in, and a new mechanic where Ellie can be shot with an arrow, with the player being forced to break it off and rip it out. Remember that bad sense I talked about near the start of the video? If Ellie's stuck with an arrow, you're not allowed to use that until you break the arrow off, and that's on top of aiming penalties. Personally, I don't care too much about the use of violence in games, especially when it's warranted narratively or used in-game like this. After all, that stuck arrow mechanic is exactly the kind of payoff to a mechanic that I was asking for earlier. With that said, there's a fine line between warranted brutality and straight-up glorified torture in the style of Tomb Raider 2013's dozens of uncomfortable Lara Croft deaths. So far, it doesn't leave me questioning who it is Ellie is killing and what their lives were like, as much as it leaves me questioning how much is too much. From what I can tell so far, The Last of Us Part 2 seems to be following in Uncharted 4 and The Lost Legacy's steps, acknowledging and improving upon many of the first part's shortcomings. The jury's still out on other issues though, and frankly, we won't know whether everything is addressed until February. I'd like to think, and I hope, that every last one of these points is addressed and then some. After all, every game's going to have its own issues. But for a game to continue dealing with 7-year-old issues that have been addressed in other games already would put Part 2 at an immediate disadvantage and likely only open up deeper problems as the game progresses. In this case, I do think that the visceral focus could become a key issue. Even if it's intended, I fear it might go overboard when players really see it in action. Above all else though, I fear the most for the pacing. Part 2 is already confirmed to be split into 2 discs, likely an install disc and a gameplay disc. That means we're looking at well over 100 gigabytes of game. Based on how much has been shown off to members of the press, I wouldn't be surprised if Part 2 runs between twice and thrice as long as the first game. And the original already had more than its fair share of pacing issues in my book. There are even 2 distinct gameplay demos being shown off behind closed doors, one of them more story focused and one that's gameplay heavy. To me, this indicates that there could be some strong exposition sections that could put the delicate balance even more at risk. I would argue that interweaved sections that accomplish both goals simultaneously would be a better bet for a more compelling overall experience instead of jumping back and forth constantly. Hell, I'll even be happy with true 3-way battles between Ellie, human enemies, and the infected. Left Behind faked it pretty well near the end, but you could see that it was pretty much just a one-on-one with you either hiding until the end or running past combat. Games have been running 3 faction fights for years, it's more than possible. Better yet, when the factions multiplayer returns as the big selling point for The Last of Us Part 2 Definitive Edition on PS5 a year from now, why not have a competitive mode that includes the infected as computer-controlled environmental enemies? It would allow for 3-way fights, it would bring new players into the rather complex multiplayer gameplay, and give them a way to earn points and experience without struggling to kill other players at first, and it could be a solid tactical option for many situations. It would essentially be a modified version of Titanfall's computer-controlled enemies in the multiplayer. But then the multiplayer should probably be a discussion for another day. The Last of Us Part 2 has a lot to live up to, possibly an insurmountable level of expectations. But again, this is Naughty Dog we're talking about here. We've already seen that they've acknowledged some of the first game's shortcomings, and I'm sure we'll see that they've handled some of the other problems as well once we've got the game in our hands. My hope is that by addressing the rest of the key issues with The Last of Us Part 1, I can help highlight what to keep an eye out for when you start up Part 2. After all, Part 2 won't be perfect either, and it certainly won't if it's already carrying the burdens held over from its predecessor. But keep in mind, no game is perfect, even if we want it to be. It's okay to look at issues and critique them, to think critically, to analyze. The Last of Us especially is a series designed to be art just as much as game, and what is art if it's not analyzed? It's nothing. Hopefully this video made you think, and hopefully it'll encourage you to go back and analyze some games that you love, or even one that you hate. I've spent a few years on this channel tearing apart some of my favorite and least favorite games for the sake of analysis, and doing so has only made me appreciate each game that much more. Hell, analyzing The Last of Us for this very video that you're watching made me appreciate it even more. Give it a shot, and when The Last of Us Part 2 comes out, hopefully I'll see you right there beside me, starting conversations, thinking critically, analyzing, and appreciating. Speaking of conversations, please feel free to leave a comment down below and let me know what you thought, either about this video, about The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2, or about what Naughty Dog's adapted thus far. As always, thank you very much for watching, and thank you for subscribing, and until the next video, stay golden. This video was made possible in part thanks to the generous support of these Patreon backers. If you'd like to see your name on this list, you can do so by supporting the channel at patreon.com/thegoldenbolt. Thank you.